So we've talked about classical conditioning and operant conditioning. Now we're going to talk about other types of learning. So a third type of learning, sometimes we have flashes of insight. So when dealing with a problem where we have been experiencing trial and error, this type of learning is called cognitive learning, right? Which is explained as changes in mental processes rather than as changes in behavior alone. Right? So before, we're focused mainly on behavior. Now we're focused on the mental part of it, right? So sometimes these flashes of insight, we can kind of like think about the light bulb that goes off like on a cartoon or on a TV show or something like that. So Wolfgang Kohler and Sultan. Sultan was a chimp, by the way. So Kohler believed that chimps could solve complex problems by combining simpler behaviors they had previously learned separately. So Kohler taught Sultan the chimp how to stack boxes to obtain bananas that were over his head and how to use a stick to obtain something that was out of his reach. He taught Sultan these skills in separate situations. So he taught him two separate things, right? Simple things. So when Sultan was put in a situation where the bananas were still out of his reach after stacking the boxes, Sultan became frustrated. He threw the stick, kicked the wall before sitting down, kind of had a little tantrum. I'm sure none of you guys have done that before when you're upset. But suddenly, he jumped up. He dragged the boxes and stick under the bananas. He then climbed up the boxes and whacked the fruit down with the stick. This suggested to Kohler that animals were not mindlessly using conditioned behavior, but were learning by reorganizing their perceptions of problems. So this is important. So we knew that like animals and monkeys could just copy a behavior. So, stack boxes or use a stick. But he used two separate things he learned and put them together, you know, to solve the problem. And that was important, right? That shows complex learning. So here are some pictures of Sultan the chimp. All right, so you can see him whacking down the bananas with the stick, and you can see him stacking the boxes there. So Sultan was not the only animal to demonstrate cognitive learning. When rats were put into a maze with multiple routes to the reinforcer, the rats would repeatedly attempt the shortest route. If their preferred route was blocked, they would choose the next shortest route to the reward, which shows learning. They weren't just randomly running through the maze. They knew the shortest route, right? And then if you block that route, then they knew the next shortest route. I mean, that shows learning, not just randomly running through something. They also use something called a cognition map, right, which is just a mental representation of a place. So if I say, hey, how do you get to your house, right? Give me directions. You might visualize, oh, you go, down this street, you take a left at the store, then you take a right, at the gas station there. So you're picturing it in your mind. That is a mental representation of a place. That is a cognition map. So Latin learning. In a similar study, rats were allowed to wander around a maze without reinforcements for several hours. It formerly was thought that reinforcements were essential for learning. Right? So we thought the only way they're going to learn is if you give them a reward for it. Well, that wasn't necessarily true, because however, the rats later were able to negotiate the maze for food more quickly than rats that had never seen the maze before. So even though they were running around randomly, at least it looked randomly, they were actually learning the maze. So then when they did put the food in, they knew how to get there faster than rats that had never seen the maze before. So we didn't know they learned the maze until they were given a reason to learn the maze. And that is called Latin or latent learning, right? Which is learning that occurs but is not apparent until the learner has an incentive to demonstrate it. So we didn't know the rats knew the maze until they had an incentive to show us, which was to get their food. This happens with students all the time. We don't know whether or not you know it, so we have to assess you to see if you've learned something. So you just kind of follow this a little bit where it shows how many errors they have. So if they're in the maze, so the bottom is the days in the maze. So notice everyone, their errors go down the more days they're in the maze. The green is if you never reinforce. Well, they never have an incentive to show us that they have less errors. The blue is always enforced, so they gradually go down. The orange-ish color one, right? That's the lane learning evidence where they're going through it. And all of a sudden, you give them a reason. Now you see a dramatic decrease, right? So they hardly have any errors. Motivation. All right, so motivation is something we'll talk about. We'll do a whole unit on it. So there's intrinsic and there's extrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation is a desire to perform a behavior effectively for its own sake, right? So an example could be studying to learn the material better because you are interested in it. So it's like reading books on your own. Extrinsic motivation, a desire to behave in a certain way to receive external rewards and avoid threats and punishment. Example, studying to earn an A on the test. So we all need to be motivated. If you're going to be successful, something has to motivate you, whether intrinsic or extrinsic. And like I said, we'll do a whole unit on this and we'll go into depth about this. But this affects our learning a lot because if you're not motivated to learn, you're not going to learn. So it could be you could do it for yourself. Like if you read a book for yourself because you're interested in it, that's intrinsic motivation. If you read a book because you had to for that class, to get a grade for that class, now that's extrinsic motivation. Observational learning. This is another one of the big learning ones that kind of go with classical and opera conditioning. Albert Bandura, right? So he is another person that you should definitely know, be able to match up. So he is kind of the pioneer researcher in observational learning. You can think of observational learning as an extension of opera conditioning in which we observe someone else getting rewarded, but act as though we had also received a reward. So what is observational learning? It's learning in which new responses are acquired after others' behavior and the consequences of their behavior are observed. So something similar to this is modeling, right? The process of observing and imitating a specific behavior. So observational learning is like the more general thing. It's all this is saying is you pretty much learn from observing people around you. So you tend to act like the people around you, right? You tend to act like your parents, your siblings, the other kids in your neighborhood, even TV, right? So you can learn from TV. Think about like these like 5 and 6 year olds using all this profanity. They had to learn that somewhere, right? You're not just born knowing all that. They had to learn that from people around them, or even a lot of times, even if they're violent, a lot of times that is learned as well. So modeling is just that for a specific behavior. So you see a lot of modeling like in your classes, especially you think about like a math class or something dealing with math, even like a chemistry class. A lot of times they're going to model how to do a problem for you first, and then you do it. And so we see this a lot as well for behavior. Like, oh, I'll model your behavior, how you're supposed to do something. Even think about like a coach, they'll model how they want you to, you know, if you're learning baseball, how to fill a ground ball, or if basketball, maybe how to shoot, something like that. So Albert Bandura has a very famous experiment called the Bobo doll experiment. So in his research, after observing adults seeming to enjoy punching, hitting, kicking, an inflated doll called Bobo. So what he did, he had two groups of kids. One group of kids watched the adults be violent with the Bobo doll, right? The children, when it was their turn to play with the Bobo doll, they acted the same way or similar, right? They were very aggressive towards the doll, very violent towards it. The other children, right, who saw adults playing not aggressively with the doll, they weren't aggressive, right? So this is significant because these children were more aggressive than those in the control condition who did not witness adults violence, which shows observation and learning because you act on how you see other people act. You see someone else doing something like, well, I mean, that's how I'm supposed to do it. So then you act that same way. That's observational learning. Mirrors in the brain. First observed by Rosselati in Italy, what he did, he knows monkeys would imitate researchers' actions, such as licking the ice cream cone, things like that. I'm sure you've heard the term monkey see, monkey do before. And so that's all it is. Like we tend to imitate. We have these mirror neurons in our brains. So it's hypothesized that there are these mirror neurons, which is like brain activity that provides for imitation and observational learning. So we do this all the time. We're constantly, copying what we see, and that's how we learn. So you can see this at a very young age. So, humans do this. If you've ever been around an infant before, children as infants stick out tongues, etc., and they imitate adults around them. So if you haven't, and you are, try it. You stick out a tongue at like a little infant, and they'll stick out back at you, right? Because they mirror whatever you do. So it's a good commercial that kind of shows, and I'll post it, that kids watch what we do and they act how we do. That's the good and the bad, right? So if you act properly, they're more likely to imitate that. If you act negative, now they're more likely to copy that negative behavior as well. So media and violence. So what do you guys think? Does violence on TV, movies, videos, games have an impact on learning of children? Well, there is some correlation, evidence from over 50 studies that show that observing violence is associated with violent behavior. Right. So in addition, experiment evidence shows that viewers of media violence show a reduction in emotional arousal and distress when they subsequently observe violent acts, a condition known as psychic numbing. Right. So there is some correlation to it. Now, everyone who plays violent games, are they going to end up being violent? No. But the younger you are, so we talked about the brain, how it develops from back to front, and that frontal part is your judgment, decision makings. Well, they see that, and a lot of times they think that's how the world's supposed to be. So you hear these stories of these younger kids who go out, they play like Grand Theft Auto and things like that, and then they like start acting out the show or acting out the game. So there is that evidence there. Now, if you're mature, you're a little bit older, you realize that's not how you're supposed to act. Or if you have someone older with you saying, hey, this is just a game, this isn't how you're supposed to act. But violence does trigger violence. If you do watch something violent, even as adults, you tend to, you know, be more violent or be more aggressive with it. And the psychic numbing, that's talking about how you just get numb to it all, right? You see violence all the time, so you just don't even react to it anymore. We see it in the news so often. You see violence as, oh, it's just another murder. But should we ever say, oh, that's just another murder? No, but we're so used to it. Think about fighting, like a lot of fights at school, where you just get used to it. Oh, there's just another fight. Where if you go to school where there's not a lot of fights, maybe people are panicking, or like let's say you hear like emergency sirens and you live in a city. Well, you're used to that because you're used to the violence, ambulance. Well, if you're in a town that's not used to that, now maybe you start to panic. Oh my God, what's going on? Right? So you just become numb to it, which I mean, I guess has benefits at times, but in the end, and hopefully we never become too numb to violence.